Good afternoon. First, let me thank Morehouse College and Dean Carter. It has been an extraordinary couple of days on campus. And this is my first visit to Morehouse. And I'm leaving here as a believer in what this education institution stands for. And to show my belief, I bought a t-shirt from the bookstore. But thank you for everything. It has been wonderful. The idea of pluralism, let's stipulate this point first. That democracies cannot succeed without having a pluralistic culture. It is essential to the flowering and success of a democratic society. And yet, democracy can instill fear, because sometimes democratic societies can make choices that religious communities may feel that they are being infringed upon. The case in point right now we see in Indiana's Religious Freedom Act and the other similar acts that have been passed around the country. So how do we then reconcile this thing? On one hand, we need it for success, and on the other hand, the very nature of pluralism elicits fear and thus reactions based on that fear. So keep that in mind as I work through this presentation. My topic, in my view, at this point in time, my research is very preliminary. So I think at this point, I'm raising more questions than I'm being able to answer them. So if I leave the presentation unfulfilled in your mind, please pardon me, and I beg for your forgiveness. Hopefully you'll give me some more ideas to complete my research. So in 2012, Pew Research Center released a survey showing issues around which the Muslim world has unity and over which they have differences. The survey was conducted in 39 countries, and it covered nearly 67% of the world's Muslim population. With regards to devotional practices such as prayer, fasting, charity, there is a great deal of consensus, not a whole lot of difference. Nearly 9 out of 10 Muslims fast during Ramadan. 7 out of 10 give charity or zakat, the obligatory charity. 6 out of 10 pray 5 times a day. Almost 100% declared their faith in God and believe Muhammad is God's messenger. Nearly 9 in 10 believe in heaven or hell and qadar or divine destiny and angels. Nearly 8 in 10 believe that Quran is the word of God. However, once we get beyond these basic agreements, there is an impressive array of diversity in thoughts and actions. On questions that elucidate Muslim attitude towards pluralism, the results are, in my view, mixed and perhaps concerning. Nearly 6 out of 10 Muslims believe that there is only one way to interpret Islam, suggesting that there's a lack of appreciation for both the historical diversity that has existed across Muslim societies and a lack of acknowledgement about how Muslims actually live in the world today. And the range of opinion was breathtaking. Nearly 78% people in Egypt believe that there is only one way to interpret Islam, to a low of 34% in Morocco. Egypt also has the highest percentage of respondents who do not believe that Sufis are Muslims, 44%. People in Egypt do not believe that Sufis are Muslims. Nearly 1 in 5 Muslims in these 39 countries that was surveyed do not consider Sufis to be Muslim, which is about 20%. Which is puzzling because much of Islam's expansion actually came through the Sufi orders. The Pew survey also shows that nearly 1 in 4 Muslims do not consider Shias to be Muslim. Once again, Egypt, the most populous Arab nation, topped the charts. 52%, nearly 1 in 2 Egyptians do not believe that Shias are Muslim. This is again ironic and contradictory because the greatest Islamic religious institution in the world, the Al-Azhar University, was established by the Fatimid Shia dynasty. Go figure that one. What is interesting also that not considering Shias as Muslims correlates negatively with the population of Shia in the country. Meaning lower the population of Shias in the country, higher the response that Shias are not Muslim. Therein is a lesson for diversity and pluralism. In the Pew survey, the three countries where Shia were more than 50% of the population, which is Azerbaijan, Iraq, and Lebanon. Iran was not surveyed in this group. So Azerbaijan, Iraq, and Lebanon, on average, only 6% of the people say that Shias are not Muslims. So once we have an energetic encounter with diversity, we are less likely to stereotype and think bad about the others. In Pakistan, which has been on the news a lot for Shia-Sunni violence, 37% of the respondents do not view Shias as Muslims. This is again interesting because this is one contradictory point of evidence from the correlation analysis that I did. Because Pakistan has one of the highest Shia minority population in the Muslim world. So generally speaking, interfaith pluralism, in my view, has really not taken root in many, many Muslim majority societies, countries. In 2006, Pew released another survey that showed that both Muslims and how Muslims and Westerners view each other. And the results were interesting. Muslims viewed Westerners as selfish, arrogant, and violent. And Westerners viewed Muslims as fanatical, violent, and arrogant. So therein is a common ground. We agree with each other. They mirror each other's sentiments. So this divide becomes even more starker when we examine what happens around, let's say, the Charlie Hebdo publication or the publication of cartoons about Prophet Muhammad. We can see the exasperation of these attitudes. Each side believing in the other, on their own moral rightness and stereotyping the other as not having an understanding of the issue. So the Pew survey went on to note, and I quote, that by wide margins, Westerners who had heard of the controversy, this is the Danish cartoon controversy, believed that Muslim intolerance is principally to blame for the controversy. So that's the view from one side. What does the other side view? While Muslims, by even more lopsided majorities, see that Westerners disrespect the Islamic religion, and that is the root of the conflict. So the clashing points of view are very clearly seen in the country of Nigeria, where 81% Muslims blame the controversy on Western disrespect, and 63% of Christians say that Muslim intolerance is to be blamed. Nigeria is a very interesting case because it has nearly half and half population of Muslims and Christians. So the 2012 Pew survey showed that the global median for Muslims who believe that many religions can get to heaven, people of many religious communities can get to heaven, is 18%, ranging from a low of 5% to a high of 50%. Now, this is interesting because when we contrast this with the attitude of Muslims living in America, so globally, only 1 in 5 Muslims believe that people of other religions can get to heaven. But when we look at the American Muslim context, 56% of US Muslims believe that other religions can lead to heaven. So again, therein is a lesson of pluralism, because Muslims over here, living in a free society, have greater opportunities to engage in interfaith dialogue, to be with people of other religious communities, and thus a greater propensity to believe that their path is also one of the right paths. So the Quran speaks at great length on the subject matter of heaven and hell, about salvation, as do other religious texts. It provides vivid descriptions of both the afterlife in both heaven and hell. And Muslim attitude towards people of other faith have generally evolved. But this evolution has taken place mostly where Muslims are living as minorities. Although hardline conservatives have often denied the salvific value of other faith, Muslim scholars, even people who are considered hardline scholars or more conservative scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim, both noted that while the garden, which is heaven, is eternal, the fire of hell is not. Which means at some finite time, the fire will be extinguished and those who are in hell will be released into heaven after having served their time. And Muslim scholars who are more moderate scholars like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Arabi inferred that the mercy of God cannot be held in such low estimation as to conceive that salvation, both in this life and the hereafter, is only attainable to Muslims. Now, with that data serving as a point of reference, I want to take a broader lens into this whole idea of diversity and pluralism. Just give me 1 minute. I need to pull up my document. So when we look at the Oxford Dictionary defines pluralism in a variety of ways. Sociologically, it defines it as a form of society in which members of minority groups maintain their independent cultural traditions. Politically, it defines pluralism as a political theory of power sharing. And philosophically, it defines pluralism as a theory or system that recognizes that there is more than one ultimate principle. But I find the most satisfying definition of pluralism comes from Diana Eck at the Harvard Pluralism Project, where she provides, in my view, a more practical method by which we can determine, detect, and actually engage in pluralism. Eck asserts that merely accepting diversity is not enough, but individuals and communities need to celebrate diversity, and therein we can distinguish it within our own attitudes and the attitudes of our communities of faith. Do they accept diversity, or are they celebrating diversity? Tolerating diversity without actually engaging in it can essentially lead to a ghettoization of the minorities. In order to actively engage with diversity will require an effort by individuals and institutions to have knowledge of the other, whoever the other is. Seeking this knowledge about the corporate practices of the other does not imply relativism. That requires us to water down our own beliefs so that we lose any of the distinguishing characteristics of our own faith. So Eck then goes on to acknowledge or write, and I quote, that pluralism is the process of creating a society through critical and self-critical encounter with one another, acknowledging rather than hiding our deepest differences, end quote. And this requires a commitment to nurture constructive dialogues that will reveal not only the commonalities between faith, traditions, and worldviews, but also highlight those differences that give each group their unique identity and distinctiveness. In the Quran, there is no precise word that can translate pluralism. There is no word, in my view, for pluralism in the Quran. However, contemporary Islamic scholars have used the word al-ta'uddiya as the Arabic cognate for pluralism. Pluralism can be practiced at 4 different levels. We can practice cultural pluralism, thaqafiyya, religious pluralism, diniya, political pluralism, siyasiyya, and economic pluralism, iqtisadiyya. Generally speaking, again, this is subjective evaluation. Across Muslim societies, there is greater acceptance of cultural pluralism, political pluralism, and economic pluralism. However, religious pluralism evokes deep-seated fears, particularly about secular and Western-inspired relativism, and which creates anxiety about undermining religious truths. So Abdul Rahman Sachadina in 2010, he noted that many contemporary Muslim scholars express deep misgivings about religious pluralism, believing that pluralism might destabilize the authority of revelation as well as the tradition that has determined the authenticity of its foundational sources and the praxis of the faith community. So Sachadina works out a schema. And I kind of hesitate using categories to box people in, but I think in the interest of this discussion, it might become necessary and useful. So Sachadina says that there are 3 categories that shape the discourse about how religion plays out in a public square. The first group of people within Islam will view religion or Islam as a civil religion and thus embrace pluralistic ideas and advocate social, political, economic empowerment of all people and not just limited to their fellow co-religionists. The second group may not fully embrace pluralism as a guiding philosophy, but they would understand its necessity in society, essentially accepting the live and let live doctrine. And the final category would emphasize the exclusivity of the Islamic truth and ardently believe that human beings in this world, and more so in the life to come, that salvation of human being in this life and the life to come is restricted to the adherents of the Islamic revelation. So to this third category, interfaith dialogue would not be possible, they would not do it. Instead of interfaith dialogue, they may resort to what they will call quote-unquote dawah, which technically means it's a non-coercive invitation to Islam, but in all practical means it is proselytization. The third category not only presents challenges in the realm of interfaith relationships, but they also imbue a worldview that Islam lacks internal pluralism. And so intrafaith diversity is ignored at best and ostracized at worst. So again, probably have a couple of minutes, right? So I want to get to my quick conclusion, but by referencing a couple of things from the Quran. In chapter 2, verse 256, the Quran states, there is no compulsion in religion. This is a categorical command, not a statement of fact. It's a command. Because the verse reads, La ikraha fid din. Linguistically, the use of the negation form la indicates that this negation is applicable both in the present and in the future. And so thus what follows after the la, no, is a perpetual command. This is akin, la ikraha fid din is very similar to la ilaha illallah, that there is no God. So what comes after that is a command that there is no God but God. So same way, la ikraha fid din. So what follows la? What follows la is ikraha. So what is ikraha? Translated as compulsion. But when we look at the root of ikraha, it comes from the three-letter root of kaf, ra, and ha. It is the same root that produces the verb kariha, which means dislike or hate, from which we also derive the word makruh, which means displeased. Legalistically, it is something that is displeasing to God. So when we read this verse in its context, la ikraha fid din, it means it's a command from God, and God hates compulsion because it is detested. So it is not that don't do compulsion, don't compel other people from following your way of life, but do not compel people from doing it because it is something that God really detests. What is interesting is what follows after the verse. After that it says there is no compulsion in religion, then it says true guidance has become distinct from error. So whoever rejects false God and believes in God has grasped the firmest handhold that will never break, and then God is all-hearing and all-knowing. Thus the roots of pluralism in Islam is sourced directly to its holy text. And failing to carry out this command is akin to not only severing the relationship with God, which will take a person not only outside the fold of Islam, but also outside the privileged status of those who believe in God. What is also interesting is that this verse appears in a chapter of the Quran that is referred as the Madani Surah, or the Medina Revelations. And there has been no verse or no revelation that came after this that negated or abrogated this revelation. Because as we know that the Medina verses are generally referred to as legislative verses in the Quran. So this idea that there is no compulsion in religion is not a philosophical statement of Islam. It is a categorical command. It's a Sharia-based value that is foundational to Islam and should be the foundation of how Muslims build relationships with other people. And there are other verses. In the interest of time, I'll just make references, and like for example, another Medina verse is chapter 3, verse number 20. But there are other verses that are called Makki verses, which were revealed in Makkah, which are much more philosophical in its nature, but also express the same sentiment. For example, chapter 10, verse 99, it says, had your Lord willed, all people on earth would have believed. So you, prophet, you cannot compel people to believe. And in chapter 5, verse 99, the messenger's duty is only to deliver the message, not to compel people from believing. And there are other indications of cultural pluralism, language diversity, diversity in God's creation, all throughout the Quran. In fact, cultural, political, religious, economic pluralism that we observe in all aspects of human civilization is viewed in the Quranic message as part of God's wisdom, not some randomness that happened in creation. And so that this idea of diversity has to compel people to compete with each other something that the Imam had mentioned in his khutbah today, towards doing good. The idea of fastabiqul khairat, meaning you compete with each other in doing good. Not just do good, but compete with each other. So your differences becomes a means of competition for doing good, not for doing evil with each other. So contemporary scholar Reza Shah Kazmi, he noted, and I quote, "For Muslims, tolerance of the other is an integral practice of Islam. It is not an optional extra-cultural luxury. The Quran sets forth an expansive vision of diversity and difference, plurality, and indeed of universality. This is all the more ironic since the practice of contemporary Muslim states, not to mention extra-straight groups and actors, falls lamentably short of these expectations, as well as the current standards of tolerance as set forth by secular West." In the interest of time, I'm going to cut it short, but by mentioning that, so given all of this evidence, where does the idea of exclusivity in Islam come from, particularly as set forth not only in the public attitude surveys that I have shared with you, but also most violently manifested in the actions of radical groups? So there are a couple of verses in the Quran. For example, in chapter 3, verse number 19, the Quran says that the true religion in God's eye is Islam. And a few verses later in the same chapter it says, if anyone seeks a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted. He will be among the losers in the hereafter. Often, exclusivists will quote these verses as citation that the only true path is the path of Islam. What is often missed over here is in these verses that Islam is not capital I Islam. It is a small I Islam, which means people who submit to the will of God. And this is, and other scholars have noted that even if you believe it's a capital I Islam, it's still, these two verses in no way overshadow the inclusivist verses in the Quran. So the more appropriate understanding of these verses, that the Islam described in these verses is an invitation to all people of faith who are willingly submitting to the will of God. So, in my conclusion, I've been saying this for the last 3 minutes, right? The practice of pluralism in Muslim society is quite varied, as we have seen through many opinion surveys and others. Factors such as democracy, economic well-being undoubtedly impact the development of pluralism. However, the most significant measures seem to be internal religious diversity in a nation. For example, larger presence of Shia population in a country reduce anti-Shia attitudes in those countries. Muslims in Europe and America are more pluralistic in their attitude than Muslims in Middle East and North Africa. So one of the unanswered questions that I have, and since there are so many great scholars in this room, I'll throw this out as an unanswered question and an area of further research. One of the things that I could not find is an index, and I'm an empiricist. I come from the field of economics and finance, so I tend to look for empirical evidence to support theses. So I could not find an empirical evidence on pluralism. For example, there is no an index of pluralism. I wish there was. So the question that I wrestled with, can human rights index proxy as indicator of pluralism? And in my view, in some sense it does, but in many senses it may not. So one of the challenges that I have for the great scholars that are both on this panel and in the audience is, can we develop, craft an indicator that in some way, in an unbiased way, can measure pluralism as it is practiced in different countries, and then we can see across time how societies are changing and how they are absorbing the different ideas out there. Thank you so much.